In the waning years of the 15th century, the city of Florence, known in Latin as Florentia, was shaken by fire, fury, and fanatical reform. At the center of this turmoil stood a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola. Known as Frate Hieronymus, Savonarola arrived in Florence in 1482 and soon became one of the most polarizing figures in Renaissance Italy. He did not come with sword or army, but with sermons, blazing, apocalyptic sermons that called for the destruction of sin and the downfall of the corrupt. The heart of Savonarola's message was simple and terrifying. God's wrath was imminent. According to his claims, Italy, corrupted by vanity, tyranny, and moral decay, was about to be punished. He denounced the widespread decadence of Florence's elite, condemned the ruling Medici family, and even dared to attack the authority of the Pope himself. But these were not idle accusations. In the pulpit of San Marco, and later in the great cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, he preached with such fire that the crowds trembled. He was not simply delivering sermons, he was delivering judgment. In 1494, history gave Savonarola his moment. Charles VIII of France invaded Italy and marched toward Florence. The Medici, having lost popular support, were expelled from the city. In the political vacuum that followed, Savonarola emerged not only as a religious leader, but as the de facto spiritual ruler of Florence. His vision for the city was not one of Renaissance splendor, but of holy repentance. Under his guidance, Florence transformed into what some have called a theocratic republic. Known as the New Jerusalem, it was governed by laws that mirrored his religious ideals. Taverns were shut down, luxuries were condemned, women were urged to dress modestly. Children, organized into bands of so-called piagnoni, or weepers, roamed the streets, urging citizens to surrender their finery and immoral books. The most infamous of these purges came during Carnival in 1497. In the center of Piazza della Signoria, Savonarola's followers constructed a colossal wooden pyramid piled high with mirrors, cosmetics, musical instruments, silk garments, and even paintings by Botticelli. This was the Falò delle Vanità, the bonfire of the vanities. With crowds chanting prayers, the flames rose, and with them, much of Florence's cultural richness was turned to ash. To his supporters, Savonarola was a prophet. To his enemies, he was a dangerous zealot. But perhaps most dangerous of all was his open condemnation of the Vatican. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, was the target of repeated attacks from the pulpit. Savonarola accused him of simony, corruption, and unworthiness of the papal office. He even went so far as to declare that the church itself was in need of purification. This was a line that could not be crossed without consequence, and soon Florence would pay the price for its prophet's defiance. By 1497, the tide had begun to turn against Girolamo Savonarola. Though he still held immense influence in Florence, his prophecies were beginning to falter, and his enemies, both inside and outside the city, were closing in. The turning point came after his public refusal to obey a papal summons to Rome. Pope Alexander VI, already enraged by Savonarola's repeated accusations of corruption, excommunicated him on May 13, 1497. The document accused him of heresy, schism, and disobedience, and it effectively marked Savonarola as an enemy of the Church. Despite the excommunication, Savonarola continued to preach. He argued that the Pope's censure was invalid, declaring that a corrupt pope had no authority to judge a servant of God. But his defiance only intensified the backlash. Political opponents in Florence began to organize. The merchant elite, artists, moderate reformers, and even former allies grew uneasy with the friars' radical control. The city, once willing to submit to his religious discipline, now simmered with resentment and unrest. The final blow came in early 1498. In a desperate attempt to prove his divine authority, Savonarola accepted a challenge for a medieval ordeal by fire. His supporter, the Franciscan friar Fra Domenico da Pescia, was to walk through flames in Piazza della Signoria to demonstrate the truth of Savonarola's prophetic mission. The event attracted a massive crowd on April 7, but as the fires were prepared, a thunderstorm broke out. Disputes over protocol and divine omens erupted between supporters and detractors. The ordeal was cancelled. The crowd, expecting a miracle, turned hostile. Savonarola's credibility collapsed overnight. 3 days later, on April 10, 1498, an armed mob stormed the convent of San Marco. After a short siege, Savonarola and two of his closest allies, Fra Domenico and Fra Silvestro Maruffi, were arrested and handed over to Florentine authorities. Their fate was sealed. The interrogation that followed was brutal and relentless. Savonarola was taken to the Palazzo della Signoria, where he was imprisoned in the Alberghettino, a small cell in the tower. There, he was subjected to torture on the strappado, a method that involved binding the victim's hands behind their back and hoisting them into the air by a rope, only to be dropped violently, dislocating shoulders and tearing ligaments. This form of torture was known in Italian as la corda, the rope. Under agony, Savonarola confessed to having invented his prophecies. He signed statements admitting that his visions had been feigned and that he had manipulated the public for political gain. But as was common in such confessions, retractions followed. When the torture ceased, Savonarola denied everything. His written statements were often contradictory, likely due to the unbearable pain and psychological torment he endured. Despite this, Florentine officials published edited versions of the confessions to justify his execution and discredit him in the eyes of the public. As the days passed, Savonarola grew weaker. He had once stood in the pulpit, declaring that Florence would be the light of Christian renewal. Now, shackled and mutilated, he awaited death. Still, he continued to pray and write meditations on psalms, showing flashes of the fierce conviction that had once shaken the city. Yet in the eyes of his captors, he was no longer a prophet, only a heretic whose voice had to be silenced. The method would be fire. On the morning of May 23, 1498, the heart of Florence transformed into a stage of death. In Piazza della Signoria, once the site of Savonarola's triumphant sermons and the infamous bonfire of the Vanities, a new structure had been erected. It was not an altar or a pulpit, but a scaffold. 3 wooden gallows stood tall against the sky, arranged above a massive pile of dry wood, kindling, and brush. The sentence was clear: hanging followed by public burning. The targets were Girolamo Savonarola, Fra Domenico da Pescia, and Fra Silvestro Maruffi. Before the execution, all 3 men were ceremonially degraded in a solemn ritual. The church first stripped them of their Dominican robes and religious status. Bishop Francesco Remolins, the papal commissioner, uttered the formal words: "I separate thee from the church militant and the church triumphant." It was a formula that denied them not only life, but salvation, a symbolic cutting off from the body of Christ. The ceremony was public and intentional. The church wanted Florence to witness the total annihilation of Savonarola's spiritual legitimacy. Then came the execution itself. The three friars were led onto the platform in front of thousands of spectators, supporters, enemies, the curious and the vengeful. They were first hanged by the neck, one by one, until they were dead. But their punishment did not end there. Almost immediately after the hanging, city officials ignited the pyre beneath them. The flames engulfed the bodies, consuming the very flesh of those who had once preached purification by fire. In a grim reversal of the bonfire of the vanities, it was now the friars themselves who fed the flames in the square where they had once burned books and luxuries. The location itself was no coincidence. Piazza della Signoria was not only Florence's civic center, it was the symbolic heart of its political life. Here, the Signoria ruled, the people gathered, and public rituals of justice and punishment unfolded. The execution of Savonarola in this space was a clear message. No one, not even a prophet in the eyes of the people, could stand above the authority of church and state. Yet even in death, Savonarola's influence could not be entirely erased. As the fire burned, some in the crowd gathered ashes and charred fragments of clothing, treating them as relics. Authorities tried to prevent this by throwing the remains into the Arno River, but fragments still circulated in secret. To his followers, he had not died a heretic, but a martyr. The response from the wider church was resolute. Pope Alexander VI ensured that all ecclesiastical records confirmed Savonarola's condemnation. His teachings were banned, and his name associated with rebellion, heresy, and false prophecy. Florence, too, tried to move on. The Dominican order at San Marco was restructured, the puritanical laws repealed, and the brief theocratic experiment forgotten, at least officially. But history has rarely treated the fire as a simple act of justice. Savonarola's rise and fall left behind a legacy of uncomfortable questions about the limits of reform, the power of religious charisma, and the cost of confronting corruption from within. His execution marked not just the end of a man, but the silencing of a vision that had promised salvation through fire, only to end in flame itself. Today, a simple circular plaque marks the spot in Piazza della Signoria where Savonarola was burned. No statue, no shrine, only stone and silence where a man once shook a city to its core. What does Savonarola's fate tell us about the cost of moral rebellion in a world governed by corrupt authority? Comment below. Your insight shapes how history is remembered. As Fra Girolamo himself wrote in his final prison meditations, facing death without regret, "The Lord has suffered as much for me. It is no great thing for me to suffer for him." Girolamo Savonarola, 1498.